It took Brian Jones 7 years to build the Rolling Stones into an empire. In a span of just over 3 weeks, the empire Brian Jones had built was dismantled by his own band. On June 8, 1969, he was still the founder and leader. By July 3rd, he was found dead in his swimming pool at the age of 27. In those 3 short weeks, the men he had recruited, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, completed a brutal coup that took his band, his sound, and his future. History remembers the legend, but it often overlooks the brutal arithmetic of his final days. This is the story of that fateful period between his dismissal on June 8, 1969, and his death on July 3rd. To understand the revolution that Brian Jones was about to ignite, you must first immerse yourself in the oppressive quiet of the world he was determined to escape. The England he was born into on the 28th of February 1942 was a nation cloaked in a pervasive weary gray. It was a country bearing the deep scars of the Second World War, a place of bombed-out city blocks, of food and petrol rationing, of a collective unspoken trauma. The prevailing culture was one of austerity and conformity, a society where the highest virtues were a stiff upper lip, a quiet resilience, and the diligent suppression of any messy, inconvenient emotions. This was the generation of Brian's parents. His father, Louis Blount Jones, was a brilliant aeronautical engineer, a man of science and precision who also taught piano. His mother, Louisa Beatrice, was a church organist and choir leader. Theirs was a comfortable middle-class home in the genteel spa town of Cheltenham, a world defined by structured harmony, intellectual rigor, and respectable order. But into this world of quiet conformity, Brian arrived as a being of pure chaotic energy, his life seemingly marked by dissonance from its earliest moments. At the age of 4, a severe bout of whooping cough nearly killed him. It left his lungs permanently scarred, bequeathing him a lifelong battle with asthma. This was not a minor ailment. It was a constant physical tether to his own mortality. Every breath was a conscious effort, a fight against a tightening in his chest. This physical fragility, this sense of being stifled from within, would become a powerful metaphor for his entire existence. He was a boy in a constant struggle for air in a world he found suffocating. Just a year after this brush with his own death, a different, more profound kind of silence fell over the Jones household. His younger sister, Pamela, who was born just a year after him, died of leukemia at the age of 2. In a family and a culture bound by emotional restraint, this unimaginable grief was likely processed not through open mourning, but through a quiet, stoic retreat. For a sensitive and intelligent young boy like Brian, the sudden vanishing of his sister would have been a foundational trauma, an early lesson in the brutal fragility of life and the unreliability of human connection. These 2 events, the chronic illness that marked him as different, and the family tragedy that shrouded his home in unspoken sorrow, seemed to carve out a hollow space within him, a deep-seated fear of being overlooked, of being insignificant, of being silenced by a world that could take everything away in an instant. This internal turmoil soon manifested as external rebellion. He was, by all accounts, a gifted student. He excelled academically, earning high marks and easily passing his exams in complex subjects like physics and chemistry. He had the intellectual capacity to follow his father into a world of science and engineering, to live the respectable life that had been laid out for him. But he wanted no part of it. He bridled against all forms of authority, seeing the rules of his grammar school and the expectations of his parents as just another form of suffocation. He was suspended twice, not for academic failure, but for a flagrant, almost performative defiance. He was a paradox, a brilliant mind housed in a fragile body, possessed by a spirit that was hell-bent on chaos. He was desperately searching for a language that could express the storm raging inside him, a language of authenticity in a world he saw as utterly, soul-crushingly fake. And then he heard it. It came crackling through the ether from 3,000 miles away, from a place he could only imagine. It was the sound of America's shadow self, the music of the juke joints, the cotton fields, and the grimy, electrified streets of Chicago's South Side. It was the blues. For a restless teenager in a gray English town, hearing the raw, distorted wail of Elmore James's slide guitar, or the haunted, otherworldly voice of Robert Johnson making a deal with the devil, was more than just a musical discovery. It was a religious conversion. This was not the polite, sterile pop music on the BBC. This was not the structured harmony of his parents' piano. This was music that was born from suffering, that bled with desire, that roared with a defiance he felt in his own bones. It was the most real, the most honest, the most human sound he had ever heard. For a boy who felt fractured and hollow on the inside, the blues became more than a passion. It became a reason for being. It was a sound he could wrap himself in, an identity he could build, note by raw, beautiful note, to protect himself from the silence he feared was waiting to consume him. His obsession with the blues was total. His parents, in an attempt to channel his restless energy, bought him a saxophone in 1957. He mastered it with an unnerving speed. 2 years later, he demanded a guitar, and with the same preternatural talent he taught himself to play, mimicking the licks of his new gods. He became a disciple, a zealot for this raw American art form. At the time, the dominant youth music in Britain was a sanitized folk hybrid called skiffle and a polite, formal genre called trad jazz. Brian held both in utter contempt. He saw them as inauthentic, a pale British imitation of a far more potent and dangerous truth. He began to preach the gospel of the blues to anyone who would listen, becoming a fixture in the local music shops, his passionate, almost academic knowledge of the genre astonishing his peers. But this quest for authenticity in music ran parallel to a profound and reckless lack of it in his own life. As he entered his late teens, his magnetic personality and ethereal good looks, combined with his burgeoning reputation as a musical prodigy, made him irresistible. He embarked on a series of relationships that were as intense as they were fleeting, leaving a trail of human wreckage that stood in stark contrast to the emotional honesty he claimed to value in his music. This wasn't just typical teenage romance. It was a pattern of behavior that revealed the deep fractures in his character. It was a desperate, almost vampiric need for connection and validation, immediately followed by a terrified flight from any form of responsibility. The pattern began to emerge with devastating speed. In 1958, at just 16, he fathered his first child with a high school girlfriend, a girl from his own respectable world. The baby was swiftly and secretly given up for adoption, a life created and then erased from his own with chilling efficiency. A year later, now 17, he engaged in an affair with a married woman named Valerie Corbett. The result was a son who was also given up for adoption by Valerie and her husband. These were not the actions of a romantic rebel. They were the actions of a boy so profoundly self-absorbed and so terrified of being tied down that he treated human lives as disposable. He seemed to view these women not as partners, but as experiences, as sources of the intense, raw emotion he wanted to feel, but without any of the lasting commitment. The chaos escalated. In the summer of 1960, another brief relationship resulted in the birth of a daughter Belinda. Brian wouldn't even learn of her existence until years later, another life set in motion by his careless passage. In 1961, there was a fleeting, doomed attempt at something that resembled a domestic life. His girlfriend at the time, Pat Andrews, gave birth to his son, Julian Mark. For a short while, they lived together in a small flat, a fragile facsimile of a family. In a rare, documented moment of what might have been paternal responsibility, Pat recalled him selling his treasured and extensive collection of rare blues records, the very scripture of his new religion, in order to buy clothes and supplies for the newborn. It was a poignant gesture, a glimpse of the man he could have been. But the impulse was temporary. The cage of domesticity, of financial obligation, of being needed by someone else, was more than his restless spirit could bear. He provided almost no support and soon drifted away, back to a life of music, freedom, and zero accountability. By the age of 19, Brian Jones had fathered at least 4 children with 4 different women and had effectively abandoned them all. This wasn't a secret life he kept hidden from his musical pursuits. It was his life. It was the work of a man who was, in a sense, a hollow vessel. He was so terrified of his own perceived emptiness that he tried to fill it with intense experiences, the raw emotion of the blues, the adoration of women, the creation of new life. But as soon as those experiences threatened to define him or make demands of him, he would flee, leaving others to clean up the mess. He was an architect of chaos. This same frantic, brilliant, and profoundly irresponsible energy was now fully focused on a new, all-consuming act of creation. He was about to build a new kind of family, a gang of musical outsiders with himself as the undisputed patriarch. He was about to start a band, and he was determined that this time it would be a family that could never abandon him. He was about to create the Rolling Stones. By the dawn of 1962, the mission that had been burning inside Brian Jones was about to find its form. London's music scene was a simmering pot of polite revivalism. In the cellar clubs and smoky pubs, the dominant sounds were trad jazz, a nostalgic and somewhat academic recreation of New Orleans music, and skiffle, a folksy DIY genre that had served as the entry point for a generation of British musicians. Into this landscape, Brian arrived as a missionary for a different, more dangerous faith, the raw, electrified, and emotionally unapologetic sound of Chicago rhythm and blues. He was a purist, a zealot, and he was looking for converts. He found his first true disciple in a quiet, barrel-chested piano player named Ian Stewart. Stu, as he was known, was a few years older, a rock of a man who worked a day job at a chemical company. But at night, he played a thunderous, rolling boogie-woogie piano that was as authentic as anything coming out of America. In Stu, Brian found a fellow purist, a musician who understood that the blues wasn't just a style of music, it was a feeling, a fundamental truth. They were the original foundation, two believers in a city of agnostics. The next converts were a pair of ambitious art students Brian encountered at the Ealing Jazz Club, a sweaty, packed basement room that had become the unlikely crucible for London's burgeoning R&B scene. They were a singer named Mick Jagger and his quiet guitar-playing friend Keith Richards. Jagger was a magnetic performer, a bundle of nervous energy who was already beginning to understand the alchemical power of stage presence. Richards was his opposite, watchful, intense, and completely devoted to the dark arts of the guitar. They shared Brian's obsession with the blues, but they were apprentices to his mastery. In those early days, the hierarchy was clear and undisputed. Brian was the teacher. He was the one with the superior technical skill, the encyclopedic knowledge of the genre. and the burning singular vision. He taught Jagger the secrets of the blues harmonica, showing him how to bend notes into cries of pain and desire. He and Keith would spend hours dissecting the guitar licks of Chuck Berry and Jimmy Reed. He was the master, and they were his eager, talented pupils. With the addition of a stoic older bassist named Bill Wyman, who owned a powerful amplifier they desperately needed, and a supremely talented jazz drummer named Charlie Watts, who initially looked down on this noisy, primitive music, but was lured in by the sheer passion of it all, the vessel was complete. In the spring of 1962, during a frantic phone call to a club promoter who was asking for the band's name, Brian's eyes fell upon a Muddy Waters album lying on the floor. One of the tracks was titled Rollin' Stone. In that moment of spontaneous inspiration, an identity was forged. He had not only assembled the band, he had christened it. For the next year, the Rolling Stones were unequivocally Brian's band. He was the engine, the visionary, and the undisputed leader. He hustled for gigs, negotiating with club owners with a confidence that belied his youth. He chose the set lists, curating a repertoire of raw, obscure blues covers that served as an education for their growing legion of fans. He was the musical director in rehearsals, arranging the songs, dictating the tempos, and pushing the band to play with a ferocious, almost violent energy. On stage, he was a magnetic, multi-instrumental force. He would switch from slashing rhythm guitar to searing slide guitar, then pick up a harmonica and unleash a wailing solo that would bring the house down. He was the focal point, the golden-haired boy who embodied the band's dangerous outsider cool. He even formalized his leadership role financially, arranging to be paid £5 a week more than the others. A small sum, but a powerful symbol of his status as the founder and boss. For a brief, brilliant period, the family he had so desperately wanted to create was a reality, and he was its unquestioned patriarch. The sound he had heard in his head was now a living, breathing, roaring entity. But the very success he was engineering was about to attract a new kind of convert, a man who would see the band not as a musical project, but as a cultural weapon, and who would, in the process, light the fuse on Brian's own destruction. In the spring of 1963, a 19-year-old publicist and aspiring impresario named Andrew Loog Oldham walked into the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond and saw the future. What he saw in the Rolling Stones wasn't just a great blues band. He saw an image, a brand, an attitude. The Beatles were already conquering the world with their charming, suit-wearing, lovable mop-top persona. Oldham, a brilliant and ruthless student of pop culture, knew that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If the Beatles were the angels, his band would be the devils. He saw in their raw energy and sullen, slightly menacing stage presence the perfect antidote to Beatlemania. He signed on to manage them, and in doing so, he set in motion a chain of events that would transform the band into global superstars and fatally undermine the man who had created it. Oldham's vision was one of provocation and image. Brian's was one of musical purity. The collision between these two philosophies was immediate and explosive, and Brian would suffer the first and most painful casualty. Andrew Loog Oldham took one look at the band and made a cold commercial calculation. 5 of them, the skinny pouting Jagger, the brooding Richards, the ethereal Jones, the silent Wyman, and the cool Watts, fit his image of decadent, dangerous youth. One of them did not. Ian Stewart, the piano-playing co-founder and the band's musical conscience, was solid, square-jawed, and looked more like a respectable tradesman than a rock and roll outlaw. Oldham decreed that Stu was out of the official lineup. He could remain as a road manager and session pianist, but he would not be on stage, not in the photographs, not a part of the official image. It was a moment of profound betrayal, and for Brian, it was the first great compromise of his artistic soul. Stu was his original partner, a fellow blues purist, the bedrock of their sound. But faced with the choice between loyalty to his friend and the promise of fame and success that Oldham was offering, Brian folded. He did not fight for Stu. He allowed his bandmate and musical compatriot to be airbrushed from the picture. It was a decision that would haunt him, a wound that would never fully heal. It was the first time he had sold a piece of his band's soul for a shot at the big time, and it was a sign of a fatal weakness in his own character. His desperate need for fame was beginning to outweigh his commitment to his own founding principles. Oldham's next move was even more significant. He understood that to compete with the Beatles, covering old blues songs was not enough. The band needed their own hits. The real money and the real power were in songwriting. He famously locked Mick Jagger and Keith Richards in a kitchen, ordering them not to come out until they had written a song. From this forced collaboration, the most legendary songwriting partnership in rock history was born. But it was a partnership that pointedly did not include Brian Jones. Brian was a brilliant musician, a gifted arranger, and a sonic innovator. But he was not a pop songwriter. He didn't have the knack for crafting the catchy melodies and relatable lyrics that were the currency of the pop charts. His genius lay in texture, in color, in the deconstruction and reassembly of existing forms. As the Jagger-Richards songwriting machine roared to life, producing a string of era-defining hits like The Last Time, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, and Get Off of My Cloud, the power dynamic within the Rolling Stones shifted seismically and permanently. Mick and Keith were no longer Brian's apprentices. They were now the creative and financial engine of the band. Brian, the founder and leader, was slowly being relegated to the role of a highly skilled session musician within his own group. He was becoming an employee. The band he had created as a blues democracy was transforming into a pop monarchy, ruled by the Glimmer Twins, with Oldham as their Machiavellian advisor. Brian was being pushed from the center to the periphery, his original vision rendered obsolete by the very success it had enabled. Despite his waning influence, the period from 1965 to 1966 marked the absolute zenith of Brian Jones's musical genius. As he grew more isolated from the band's creative process, he poured all of his restless energy into becoming their sonic architect, a multi-instrumental wizard who painted the black and white canvases of Jagger and Richards' songs with a palette of vibrant, exotic, and utterly revolutionary colors. The album Aftermath, released in late 1965, is the ultimate testament to his singular vision. It was on this record that he truly became the band's secret weapon, pushing their sound far beyond the confines of rhythm and blues. His quest for new sounds became an obsession. During a band trip, he stumbled upon a sitar in a London shop. He bought it, and with his innate musicality, quickly taught himself the basics. In the studio, he unfurled its strange, mystical drone all over the track, Paint It Black. It was a sound no one had ever heard in a Western pop song before. It was alien, ancient, and hypnotic. It transformed a good rock song into a timeless, global masterpiece. This was not a gimmick. It was a stroke of pure genius that single-handedly opened the door for the psychedelic experimentation that would define the rest of the decade. His innovations were relentless. He brought an Appalachian dulcimer into the studio and used its delicate, folksy chime to create the medieval tapestry of Lady Jane. He experimented with a marimba, using its woody percussive tones to craft the iconic, unforgettable riff of Under My Thumb, giving the song a cool, detached menace that the guitars alone could not have achieved. He played the recorder on Ruby Tuesday, adding a touch of Baroque melancholy that elevated the song into a timeless ballad. He was a one-man orchestra, a conduit for sounds from all over the world, a man who heard a symphony in his head and had the talent to bring it to life. He was ensuring that the Rolling Stones sounded like no other band on earth. But this period of brilliant creativity was also a descent into a personal hell. As his power in the band diminished, he became more erratic, more insecure, his behavior fueled by a growing dependency on drugs and alcohol. And it was during this time that he met the woman who would become both his greatest muse and his ultimate destroyer, Anita Pallenberg. She was a German-Italian model and actress, a force of nature who was in every way his female equivalent. She was beautiful, intelligent, fiercely independent, and possessed a sense of style and decadent cool that was even more potent than his own. When they met in 1966, their connection was immediate and explosive. They became the era's it couple, a vision of androgynous bohemian perfection. Their relationship was a whirlwind of passion, glamour, and terrifying self-destructive intensity. They were two sides of the same volatile coin. Their love was a creative furnace, but it was also profoundly toxic, marred by jealousy, paranoia, and episodes of shocking violence. They were locked in a codependent dance of love and abuse, pushing each other to new heights of aesthetic brilliance and new depths of personal despair. Brian had finally met his match, but the reflection he saw in her eyes was perhaps too close to the chaos he feared was inside himself. The breaking point, the moment from which there would be no return, came in the spring of 1967. The band, along with Anita, traveled to Morocco, a trip that was meant to be an escape, but which devolved into a nightmare. Brian had fallen gravely ill with pneumonia and was hospitalized, his already fragile psyche further weakened by fever and paranoia. The tension between him and Anita, which had been simmering for months, finally boiled over. There was a violent confrontation, an ugly culmination of their destructive pattern. And in the aftermath, Anita Pallenberg made a decision that would shatter the fragile ecosystem of the Rolling Stones forever. She left him. She got into a Bentley with Keith Richards and drove away, leaving Brian alone and broken in a foreign country. This was not just the end of a love affair, it was a coup d'etat. It was a devastating public humiliation and the final symbolic transfer of power within the band. Keith, his quiet, watchful apprentice, had not only usurped his role as the band's creative foil, but had now taken the woman who had been the center of his universe. The betrayal was absolute, cutting across the lines of love, friendship, and professional loyalty. The family he had built had turned on him. The identity he had forged as the beautiful, untouchable leader was shattered beyond repair. He was now truly an outsider, a king in exile. The golden age was over and a long, dark period of decline was about to begin. His world, once so full of sound and fury, was beginning to shrink, the walls closing in, the silence waiting just beyond the door. The Brian Jones who returned to London from Morocco in the spring of 1967 was a changed man. The golden-haired peacock, the arrogant, confident leader who had bent the city's music scene to his will, was gone. In his place was a fragile, haunted figure, a man whose psyche had been shattered by illness and a betrayal so profound it had shaken the very foundations of his identity. He had flown to Africa as a king, accompanied by his queen, and had returned a ghost, having lost his lover, his best friend, and what little remained of his authority within the band he had created. He returned to a swinging London that he had helped to invent, but the party now felt alien and menacing. The world he had built was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage, and the walls were closing in with terrifying speed. The cultural revolution that Brian and the Stones had championed had provoked a powerful and punitive response from the British establishment. A conservative moral panic was sweeping the nation, and the long-haired, rebellious rock stars were the perfect scapegoats. A concerted campaign, led by the infamous drug squad detective Norman Pilcher, was launched to make an example of them. The Rolling Stones, as the designated bad boys of rock, were target number one. The first blow fell not on Brian, but on Keith Richards, with the legendary police raid on his country home, Redlands. But Brian's turn was inevitable. On May 10, 1967, police raided his own apartment. The bust itself was almost theatrical in its setup, but the consequences were brutally real. He was charged with possession of cannabis. For Brian, the arrest was more than a legal problem. It was a psychological catastrophe. His already fragile health made the prospect of prison a terrifying, potentially fatal one. His chronic asthma, which could be triggered by stress, flared up. The public humiliation and the grueling court appearances exacerbated his already spiraling paranoia. He became a cornered animal, convinced that the world was conspiring against him, and in a way, it was. The legal system, the press, and even his own bandmates seemed to be aligned in a grand spectacle of his downfall. He was found guilty and initially sentenced to 9 months in prison, a shockingly harsh sentence that was later overturned on appeal and reduced to a fine and probation, but the damage was done. He was now a convicted criminal, a marked man. This legal persecution became a recurring nightmare. A year later, in May 1968, he was arrested again, this time for cannabis possession found in his apartment. He claimed the drugs had been left by previous tenants, a plausible story, but one that was irrelevant in the eyes of the law. The cumulative effect of these arrests was devastating. Beyond the mental and emotional toll, they had a catastrophic professional consequence. With 2 drug convictions to his name, there was now virtually no chance that he would be granted a work visa to enter the United States. For a band whose entire future depended on conquering the massive American touring market, this rendered him commercially useless. He wasn't just an unreliable drug addict anymore, he was a financial liability, an anchor weighing down the entire enterprise. The final practical argument for keeping him in the band had been obliterated. His disintegration was most painfully obvious in the one place that had once been his sanctuary, the recording studio. During the sessions for the band's psychedelic opus, 1967's Their Satanic Majesty's Request, he made his last significant coherent musical contributions. Withdrawn from the songwriting process, he retreated into the world of pure sound, becoming a master of the mellotron, a strange new keyboard instrument that could simulate orchestral sounds. He used it to weave the album's bizarre, hallucinatory soundscapes, his last great act of sonic architecture. But by the time the band regrouped in 1968 to record Beggar's Banquet, the ghost was fading completely. In a moment of supreme and tragic irony, the Stones decided to abandon the psychedelic experimentation of Satanic Majesties and return to the raw, stripped-down, blues-based rock and roll of their origins. They were returning to Brian's original vision, the very music that he had founded the band to play. But Brian was no longer capable of leading them there. The stories from those sessions are heartbreaking. He would show up to the studio, if he showed up at all, in a state of near catatonic intoxication. He would sit for hours, an instrument in his lap without playing a note. He would fall asleep at the mixing console. The other band members, now working with a focused professional efficiency, began to simply ignore him, recording his parts themselves or bringing in outside musicians. The man who had taught Mick Jagger how to play the harmonica now sat silently, while Jagger recorded the harmonica parts. He was a phantom at the feast, a living embodiment of the past in a room that was ruthlessly focused on the future. His physical and creative erasure was nearly complete. In the final months of his life, Brian made one last desperate attempt to find peace. In November 1968, he purchased Cochford Farm, a beautiful sprawling estate in the serene Sussex countryside. This was not just a rock star's mansion. It was a place steeped in a mythology of childhood innocence. It was the former home of A. Milne, the very place where the whimsical stories of Winnie the Pooh had been written. For Brian, a man whose own childhood had been marked by trauma and whose adult life had become a waking nightmare, the farm represented a powerful symbolic retreat. It was a chance to escape the chaos of London, the persecution of the police, and the cold indifference of his bandmates. It was a desperate attempt to build a sanctuary, to return to a place of imagination and safety, to finally breathe. But the sanctuary would soon become the site of his final exile. The other stones had reached their breaking point. Brian's inability to contribute to the music, coupled with the certainty that he would never be able to tour with them in America again, made his position untenable. The band was a global business, and he was a broken piece of machinery. On the 8th of June, 1969, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Charlie Watts made the solemn drive out to Cochford Farm. There, amidst the idyllic beauty of the English countryside, they performed the final brutal act of excommunication. The conversation, by all accounts, was short, quiet, and devoid of emotion. It was a business meeting. They informed him that the band he had started, the band that bore the name he had given it, was moving on without him. He was fired. He was offered a generous severance package, a lump sum of £100,000 and an ongoing annual payment of £20,000 for as long as the band continued. It was a golden handshake, a price tag placed on his foundational role in rock and roll history. Faced with the finality of it, Brian did not rage. He did not argue. The fight had long since gone out of him. He accepted the terms with a quiet, defeated resignation. The institution he had founded, the family he had so desperately tried to keep, had now formally excommunicated him. The identity that had been his shield and his purpose for 7 years was officially stripped away. He was no longer the leader of the Rolling Stones. He was just Brian Jones, a frail, wealthy, and profoundly lost 27-year-old man, alone in his storybook house, with nothing but the silence ahead of him. Less than a month later, that silence would become absolute. The night of July 2nd, 1969 was warm and still at Cochford Farm. Brian had spent the day with a few companions, his Swedish girlfriend Anna Wåhlin, a friend and nurse, Janet Lawson, and a builder named Frank Thorogood, who had been living on the property with his girlfriend, performing renovations and acting as a de facto handyman and minder for Brian. The relationship between Brian and Thorogood was known to be strained, with simmering resentment over unpaid wages and Thorogood's growing frustration with Brian's erratic behavior. The official verdict for his death on July 3, 1969, was death by misadventure, suggesting that his health, severely weakened by long-term drug and alcohol abuse, led to a medical episode while intoxicated, causing him to drown. However, for decades, the theory of a darker truth has persisted, centering on Frank Thorogood, one of the last people to see Brian alive. This theory is bolstered by a supposed deathbed confession from Thorogood, who allegedly admitted, "It was me that did Brian." Additionally, eyewitness accounts changed over time, describing a tense atmosphere and an argument between the two men shortly before Brian's death. Although police have reviewed the case multiple times, they have always concluded there is insufficient new evidence to overturn the original verdict. Consequently, Brian Jones's death remains a profound mystery. This duality was perfectly captured just 2 days after his death. On July 5, 1969, the Rolling Stones proceeded with a previously scheduled free concert in London's Hyde Park. What was originally intended to introduce their new guitarist Mick Taylor was instantly transformed into a massive public memorial for Brian. Before a crowd of over 250,000 people, Mick Jagger, dressed in a white frock, read an excerpt from Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Adonais in tribute before releasing thousands of white butterflies. While a seemingly beautiful gesture, many of the butterflies, poorly kept, fell dead from their boxes. The event perfectly symbolized the band's complex legacy, a moment of genuine tribute mixed with savvy public relations, marking a beautiful but somewhat hollow end to Brian's chapter and the ruthless continuation of the Rolling Stones machine. In the end, the story of Brian Jones comes full circle, back to the search for a sound that could fill a void. He felt a profound silence, a fracture deep within himself, and he spent his entire life trying to drown it out. He found a sound in the raw honesty of the blues. He built a fortress of sound with the loudest rock and roll band in the world. He colored the world with new and beautiful sounds drawn from every corner of the earth. But the identity he built for himself was as fragile as his own health. When he was cast out of his own sonic cathedral, he was left with nothing but the silence he had been running from his entire life. The final heartbreaking image of him floating in the still, quiet water of a garden built for children's stories is the ultimate metaphor. He was the man who gave the world so much unforgettable sound, only to be consumed at last by a profound and final silence.